Hey there, guitar geeks. Guitar Guts back with another video about broken guitar headstocks. If you visit eBay shopping for guitars and you type in the words broken guitar, you'll find a lot of guitars come up with broken off headstocks. It's generally a break in the neck area near where the nut is, and it's usually a crack in the wood and not actually a break in the glue joint. When you search for this, though, you'll usually find half a dozen guitars come up that are either Epiphone or Gibson SGs or Les Paul guitars. I know those are more numerous guitars anyway, but they far outnumber any Fender Teles or Squier Teles or Fender Strats or Squier Strats that you see with a headstock broken off in the same way. You rarely, if ever, really see a Fender guitar with a snapped off headstock the way the Epiphones and the Gibsons sometimes end up. And that's because of what is probably obvious to you in the picture that I've got set up here. It's the angle of the headstock. So that pretty much explains it all, but let me belabor the point because I've got nothing better to do today. If you look at the Fender guitar on the bottom, this is a Fender Strat, you'll see that the neck is pretty much in line with the headstock. It's a straight shot all the way across. But if you come up here to the top and look at this Gibson SG guitar, you'll notice that the neck takes a pretty significant dive when you're heading down with the headstock angle. And Gibsons use headstock angles varying from 14 degrees to 17 degrees over time on different models in different years. I think it's around 17 degrees right now. And that causes the stress of a drop guitar to affect it differently than a Fender guitar. Let me show you what I mean. Let me get the SG out of the way and then let you look at what happens when you drop a Fender guitar on the floor. When a guitar falls off a guitar stand or anything that you've got it propped up on, a lot of times the top of the neck is what hits first. And if you look at this Fender guitar and you see how it's hitting the ground here, you'll see that as it hits, the force is spread out over a long distance here. And what's usually hitting first is not actually the tip of the headstock, it's the tuners that hit first. And they're hitting over a pretty wide flat area here. So the force is spread out along the tuners on the headstock, and it's not concentrated on any one point. It's not usually the tip that hits first. And that's why while you'll see Fender guitars that are dinged up on the top here, you'll see some that have a few little dents. Mine doesn't yet, but it probably will. It's usually not chipped or broken on the tip. Gibson guitars, on the other hand, with their angled headstock, let me get that up here. When they fall to the floor, the first thing that hits is usually the tip of that headstock. Now, it could be that one of the tuners back here hits if it's thick enough right here that it would hit first, but it's still force at one point toward the end of the headstock instead of spread out over the entire length of the headstock. So you've got that tip hitting the ground first, and that tip hitting sends the force from the hit up toward this joint. And that's usually where you see the break occur. It'll occur right where the nut lays on the neck. And it's not a glue joint that's breaking right there. The glue joints are usually pretty strong, stronger than the wood in some instances. What'll crack right there is the wood itself. And a lot of times on eBay you'll see ads for guitars that say they have a finish crack right there. And it's probably actually that the wood is busted up underneath there. It's not cracked completely loose, but the wood's busted, and that's probably why the finish is cracked right there too. If you want a guitar that's guaranteed to work good, I generally avoid those sales. Unless you're really good at woodworking and you want to spend the time taking that thing apart and splicing it back together, it's usually more hassle than it's worth. Now, it's not just Gibson guitars that have angled headstocks. There are other guitars that have angled headstocks, such as, let me get my Jackson up here, Jackson Dinkies. This Jackson guitar also has an angled headstock. You can see it when I hold it like that. And the angle's, it's about the same angle that the Gibson SG and Les Paul has, but there's a built-in safety mechanism. on the Jackson Dinkies and other pointy guitars from the 1980s. And that's the fact that the wood is so thin right here. It's a very thin little pointy section of the guitar. There's not much mass to it. And so when these guitars hit, like this one did when I dropped it, it's not the neck that busts. It doesn't send enough force down through here to crack at the nut. It'll crack right here at the tip, and this one is, if you can see it there. I'll flip it over here in a second and let you see the back, but I broke the tip off this guitar when I dropped it exactly the way I was showing you with the other two, and it cracked it right down through there. I don't know if the camera's picking that up or not, but it's a hairline little crack right there, and I didn't do a great job gluing it back on. There's a chip out of it right here in the binding. But because that tip's so thin, it gave way before the force could travel back to the neck joint and do any damage. So you'll see a lot of Jackson guitars and other pointy guitars from the 1980s missing a little bit of the tip, but if it hadn't been for that, they might be like a lot of the Epiphone, Les Pauls, and SG and be missing their entire headstock. So I think it's a pretty good little safety mechanism, even if the guitar looks a little silly with its tip missing. So there you've got it. The reason that SG guitars break more often than Fenders do is because of the angle of that headstock. If you want a guitar that you can use as a battle axe, you might want to go for a Fender Strat or maybe a Teles. But if you treat your guitars the way you're supposed to and you don't bang them around too much, Gibsons are just as strong as anything else and they'll last you for years and years. Just be sure not to drop them the wrong way on a hard surface. Well, that's all I've got for today, guys. If you've got any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section below. Be sure to like our videos, and we'll see you next time.